Good afternoon and welcome to this GreenWeek session number 5.3, Money Talks, everything you always wanted to know about the EU taxonomy. We have a wonderful panel for you today, and I'll introduce our guests in just a moment. My name is Nathan Fabian. I am the chair of the Platform on Sustainable Finance, and I am also the Chief Responsible Investment Officer at the PRI. And joining me today are three colleagues from the platform who are all working diligently, I can assure you, many hours on the taxonomy. The first is Sonia Haider, who is Senior Business and Investors Advisor at ChemSec. The next is Mukund Bhagwat, who is an expert from Eurometto. And last but not least, we have Nick Marchese, who is Senior Environmental Specialist at the EIB. Let me share a few opening thoughts with you about the taxonomy. The introduction of explicit environmental goals in our policy frameworks has changed the foundations of our industrial planning and our private financing activities. No longer is incremental progress from today's economy sufficient. Rather, we must have a judgment about the implications of the environmental goals we are now adopting and incorporate the implications of these goals into our actions today. The taxonomy helps us to understand these goals in practice by identifying the levels of environmental performance we need in our economic activities. And it is the ability of business to strive to meet the goals that will inform their attractiveness to private financiers, to banks, and to investors. The ability to strive to meet the goals with these criteria in the taxonomy that will start to attract finance for their futures. Now, the reasons for this are simple. We know that companies must invest to meet the criteria of the future to show that they can flourish in an economy that meets the goals, that they can provide jobs, and of course, from the perspective of private finance, that they can generate financial returns from their activities. Now, let's be honest. We know that some people hope, some of our community hopes that we can slow down transition and that this will make it easier to fund business today, to raise finance, in the hope that changes can be made in practices later on. But ultimately, this is a false economy. The consequence of too little foresight today is much greater change later. And of course, this is unavoidable unless you think humanity does not need a biodiverse ecosystem or clean water or clean air or a livable climate, and that these goals can be missed without consequence. If we accept that the goals must be realized, then change is inevitable, and we must prepare for that change as soon as possible. And this is what the taxonomy helps us achieve. And so we must strive for a taxonomy that's science-based, even when the transition that is implied by the goals is very challenging. Now, of course, the detail matters, and we shouldn't pretend that this transition is without challenge. We know it is. Business needs to consider what technologies are available. What are their costs? When should the large transformational investments be made? And what should be done to improve performance until then? These are the issues we will discuss in our panel today. Before we commence, if I may give you a couple of moments of an update on the state of play with the taxonomy. We know that we now have an adopted delegated act for climate mitigation and climate adaptation activities. This is an excellent start, and our hope is that the market will start reporting as planned under the taxonomy regulation from January 2022. We know that many of you in the audience will already be preparing for your first disclosures. But in addition, we have our technical working group that is developing new criteria for our new environmental objectives. And pollution prevention and control is one of those objectives and will feature in our discussion today. Now, one of the reasons this work on further criteria for pollution prevention and control is so important and interesting is that we recently have the Zero Pollution Action Plan adopted by the Commission on the 12th of May, so only weeks ago. And this is an example of the types of goals that we now need to start to turn our attention to. And we must set criteria that reflects the ambition of these goals so that business, so that finance can start to understand where to place the investments of the future. And so our panel here is going to discuss these developments through the panel session over the next hour. Before we commence, last point from me, you are able to ask questions. You just need to join Slido. I believe that is indicated on your screen. And if you do so and ask questions, our moderator will present those to me for sharing with the panelists at the end of the session. So once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and why don't we commence? So let me see, Sonia, can we start with you, please? In simple terms, what is your view of the purpose of the taxonomy, and why is it important to your organization?
Well, taxonomy, in my perspective, is the way to channeling money into those business activities which are sustainable and which then really aiming to shift from the business model we have at the moment, where we are polluting the environment, where we really have severe consequences, to a more sustainable business and economy. So that is the aim. And my organization, ChemSec, we are an environmental NGO, and we are solely looking at the topic of chemicals. We are working with the investment community already since 10 years, informing them about financial risks, but also the opportunities that arise when you have safer alternatives, safer materials. And we have found out that it's really quite difficult with this topic to get through, because the investors are mainly concentrating on climate change. So therefore, we are really happy that taxonomy has a more holistic picture of all the environmental topics, which we really have to tackle at the same time. I know, again, it's challenging, but we have to really stick into the boundaries of our planet. And that's where I think taxonomy can play a good role for it. You're muted.
Thank you, Sonia. That's very clear. And can you tell us what you're working on inside the platform at the moment? What contribution are you making?
Yes, first of all, I was really honored to draft with a group of experts the pollution ambition, the high level of it's the aim where we want to, the vision where we want to go to in the topic of pollution. And secondly, I'm working in a sector team on chemical manufacturing. And there we develop criteria, so-called substantial contribution, what the chemical industry can bring to this shift. So how we shift the whole business activities and reduce the pollution. And there I'm quite happy that we are already quite far with our substantial contribution, but there will be a way to go.
Thanks, Sonia. Let's meet our next panelist now, Nick Marchese. You work with the EIB. What do you see as the EIB's role to further develop pollution prevention investments?
Thanks, Nathan, for the question. I hope you can hear me well. So first of all, glad to be here and to share EIB's vision and participation in the taxonomy effort. So EIB has taken the taxonomy very seriously from the beginning. As you know, Nathan, but maybe not a lot of people know, the EIB has been involved from the very beginning of the process when the taxonomy was still an idea and a concept and a possibility. and we have accompanied the full process, and we have at the same time learned in the process, and we have, I expect, also contributed to the process by providing some concrete first-hand and on-the-ground experience that we have with our clients of all sorts, being corporates, financial intermediaries like funds, banks, and other kind of beneficiaries. So this has been extremely exciting. We have committed in late 2020 to fully align with the taxonomy as soon as all the elements of the taxonomy are defined. And in fact, we have anticipated this alignment by developing our own internal taxonomy, if so we can call it, which guides our investment towards projects which tackle the 6 environmental objectives in a more focused way. And that guides also our reporting from now on, because that essentially is what the taxonomy does, and will definitely channel our funding towards more focused investment in these areas. I can provide examples of projects we have financed in the past that fall into this, but maybe I'll leave it for a subsequent question.
Thanks, Nick. We will come back to you on that. And Mukund, you work with industry organizations every day that must plan and carefully manage their interaction with the environment. And of course, you've been doing this for many years. So what is your view of the role taxonomy can play, and what contribution are you making to the development of the taxonomy? And you're on mute too.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Commission, for giving this opportunity to be part of this exciting journey of transformation, because on one side it is challenging, and usually the excitement comes after we have let's say, overcome the challenge. And at this moment, it is very hard, tough, uphill battle in going there. But at the same time, this is what the non-ferrous metal industry, which I'm representing, has been doing over the last, I would say, almost century, because some of our plants are like 100 years old, 150 years old, etc. So while we are providing materials which are required for the European Green Deals, it has to be done sustainably. This is understood. But what is sustainable depends on the context, depends on region, depends on the group of nations like European Union. And we are very happy that European Union is today leading not only in the environmental objectives, the 4 environmental objectives, but also the social objectives. So as an industry, we are looking forward to sustainable finance taxonomy, not only as a reporting tool, but as a guiding tool to say what is requested by the society, particularly for the front runners who want to be ahead of the curve before the regulation becomes a binding regulation. And taxonomy provides this opportunity. What is also important about contribution, Eurometo was not involved in the technical expert group as a full member, but we provided 5 additional experts, 2 from copper, 3 from aluminum, when the initial criteria were defined to see the realizability of this criteria balanced with the ambitions required for achieving at that moment, for example, the carbon neutrality objective given by the Paris Agreement. So we continue the same thing today. That is my role today in the sector team 2, as we call it, mining and metal production, metal processing, where we have very diverse commodities participating. Just to name a few, you have aluminum, copper, zinc, lead, nickel, precious metals, but also lithium, cobalt, etc. So some activities which are absolutely essential for achieving European Green Deal, windmills, e-mobility, but at the same time have polluting impact. And the question is, how can we attract investments to those who want to do it, so on a voluntary basis, to improve beyond what is today best technologically possible, and to what extent finance can help, not only to deploy the existing best available technology, but to develop and innovate, let's say, breakthrough technology in the future.
Malcolm, thank you. And may I just follow up on that point, because I think it's a critical point. Are your members seeing that opportunity? Do they think that this can work for them? Do they think that it can attract finance to those steps of investing in the best available and trying to attract finance for the innovation? How is that going in practice?
So I will give a frank answer. At the moment, the sustainable finance taxonomy is, let's say, we are trying to understand the complexity of application for revenue recognition, complexity of acceptance for investment recognition in terms of alignment with the sustainable finance taxonomy. In general, until now, we have been able to get finances. That was not an issue, because when you are putting a new plan, you need to think 10 years in advance. So sustainable finance taxonomy is considered as a challenge, because although the zero pollution action plan, the chemical substances strategy, all are, let's say, have been announced, the exact technical concrete filling of the criteria is not. And when we are debating with the industry, there is of course some anguish about, okay, what is it going to bring forward? Can we fulfill it? Is it realistic? And that is where, let's say, our role as member of the platform is to be a bridge between the requirements by the society as expressed by the sustainable finance taxonomy and the industry, who knows what can be achieved best based on the past experience. But I think the bridge or the challenge is to bridge. It is not about past experience. It is about what we want to achieve and how to achieve it. And that is where the know-how is existing. But to apply that know-how, I think we will still need a lot of debate. I hope that answers your question.
It's a great start. Thank you very much. We've got a good 40 minutes yet, so we'll delve even more deeply. Sonia, let's come back to you. A key companion to the zero pollution action plan is the EU chemical strategy for sustainability. How will these two strategies influence the development of taxonomy criteria?
Well, actually, first of all, I want to express my or even gratitude that in the EU, we have the EU Green Deal. And with that, more and more legislation is coming up, which puts us on the track back where we had, I don't know, a decade ago maybe, where good environmental legislation is coming out of the EU. Like we may remember air pollution and water, rivers, which are more cleaner now. And in the last 10 years, nothing much happened. So I'm really grateful that we have now the chemical strategy and also the zero pollution action plan, because for both the topic we are working on, the chemicals, play an important role. We will identify more hazardous substances. We will show way forward how to remove them, how to phase them out. And if I link that to taxonomy, where we have at the moment 4 topics, and this is water. And if you think on pollution, you have pharmaceuticals in the water, you have the plastic problem in the oceans. So there is a big relevance there. For biodiversity, we have polluted air and soil. So we really have to make sure and remedy those problems. And these are all pollution problems. So the pollution is a larger one, an overarching one. And then we also have circular economy. And again, chemicals play an important role here. They are the basic of all the materials. And we really need to get them safe and sustainable by design so that we can use them again and again. And if you just think of your computer, there are brominated flame retardant in there, for example. And if you take them back, you have to open it, and then you are exposed to the bad stuff again. So there's a big incentive for circular economy to get out and get rid of the hazardous chemicals from the very design stage. And if I would like to raise another example, which is discussed also next door. It's PFAS, and these are a chemical group called perfluorinated substances. And you know all of that because in your outdoor jacket, it's the additives which makes it water resistant. Or even if you have takeaway food, your food container, the cardboard box is covered with perfluorinated substances so that it's not sucking through. Yeah. So we have a lot of these uses still and this is really polluting. Also, the products are polluting at the end our environment, but also the material streams. So I think really in taxonomy we can make a good good investments into those alternatives so that we can get rid of it. And if I go back to PFAS, there is a Hollywood film out there at the moment called Dark Waters, where you see which impact that has. And I must admit, it's not an easy film to watch because you see birth defects, malformations of children, and also dying cows, and how the land is polluted. And but we really have to stop those pollution in the future. And I think taxonomy is a step forward.
That's very clear, Sonia. Thanks for setting out the case so clearly. So let's go to Nick. Nick, how will the Zero Pollution Action Plan influence the EIB's work? Are you already prepared to invest along to meet those goals?
So the zero ambition pollution plan it's a very recent document. First of all, and it is a relatively high level ambition document. So as it is the case for the taxonomy, which needs to go down into further level of detail and granularity in defining the criteria. So we have to do the same thing when we have to look at investments, and a very high level ambition is not particularly helpful for that purpose. So what happens is that we, as EIB, we now need to translate that document into something which is operationally viable for us to identify and generate, originate, as we say in the jargon, investments which are really going in the right direction. This requires, first of all, absorbing the essence of the zero pollution ambition plan, and then translating it into and expanding what we already do, which is the obvious first choice, going into expanding what we already have been financing in the past. And then possibly expanding to other areas. So it is not an immediately obvious process, knowing that the bank, the EIB is an investment bank. So essentially, we provide loans and we expect a return on investment, because this is what we are designed to do. So we have to ensure that the projects we are financing are viable. And there are a lot of opportunities there, but we need to ensure that these are properly captured and channeled in a proper financing framework. The taxonomy will help us in ensuring that the promoters will be the first one to ask us for investment in these areas. This will be an enormous help for us, because we are, in many ways, we are at the sort of receiving end of investment proposals. We don't have a role traditionally, we don't have a role in going out and propose investments. We receive investment proposals and we filter them for what we think it's a viable investment. This is actually something that the bank is going to change, or at least it's striving to change, because especially in new areas which are related to the environment, we need to work more upstream to the investment to be able to influence the focus of the investments increasingly in areas related to the 6 environmental objectives. The EIB realizes this is a very important element now of the business, and this is something that is cooking to try to ensure that we really work upstream even further and even more than what we did before. We do have technical assistance capacity in many aspects, but this can be more channeled and more focused on the specific environmental objectives. I must clarify, which I forgot to say before, that the bank has a very clear target now of reaching 50% of investment, I mean, overall volume of investment over a year, which translates in practice in approximately 33 billion every year into projects which are directed to the 6 environmental objectives. So that is starting 2025. According to our estimates, we are now at 40%. And with climate objectives taking the lion's share because of the recent entry of the environmental objectives, but which will be ramped up as fast as possible. I close here. I have some concrete examples that I could make. Maybe that's useful to bring them in now. I mean, we have, just to give you an example of the palette of kind of investments we already do in pollution prevention. So we have, only last year, we have invested in port facilities to treat the slop, which is basically the mix of water and hydrocarbons, which is often found on in ships, and it needs to be, which is usually discharged at sea. And this facility allows ships to discharge into a treatment facility, and then for the treatment facility to actually be able to recover the material, the hydrocarbons, which can be then reused. We have a specific fund which is dedicated exclusively to remediation of polluted land, which was financed and covering many countries in the EU. And then we have another very interesting example of financing in Finland, where the government has decided to invest in the school system because there was a big problem of indoor air pollution in many schools, which required a complete refurbishment of public schools of many public schools in Finland, and that was a very big investment. So these are just 3 examples which cover completely different kinds of pollution, but which are already part of our portfolio. And it is just a question of building on this basis to increase the volumes.
Sorry,
you're muted.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, thanks, everyone. Nick, there's lots of interesting insights in there about how the bank sets targets, about how you see taxonomy sitting between the high-level goals and the investment decisions. It's a very nice description of the way taxonomy will get used. And my observation is that many private investors are starting to use the same formula, observing the high-level goal, setting the targets, then using the criteria to start to check through investment opportunities and make the right allocation decisions. So this is the big transformation I think we're seeing in finance. Thanks for describing that so well. Mukund, if I may come back to you. So you started to talk about the types of decisions that companies must face. And I wonder if you could give us some examples as well, what this means in practice. So when it comes to investment decisions, innovation, and making those judgments around the opportunities that businesses have, can you share some examples or some ideas about what this means in practice with us?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I will give a few examples. When we are talking about pollution, what is affecting today a lot of pollution is, for example, dust. Now the dust comes from the industry, but it also comes from automobiles. It also comes from the tires. It also comes from, let's say, heavy vehicles, which are transporting, let's say, ores, minerals, etc. So when we talk about dust from the factory itself, what is possible? You can enclose one factory, but then there are diffused emissions. So you can enclose that factory along with the area into a second building and try to capture all those dust. Of course, this is a heavy investment, but when you have to achieve these objectives, this investment have to be planned. These are not done only for sustainability, somehow they have to be weaved in the capital or capacity increase decisions. So what is interesting or important with sustainable finance taxonomy, when you have an idea of what levels you want to achieve, I understand zero pollution ambition, but I still prefer to what, for example, in the energy field called nearly zero energy building. So before you go to zero, I think we first have to achieve nearly zero. And concept like this, for example, building in a factory in a factory, will achieve nearly zero pollution. But of course, you still have to manage from the transportation of trucks, etc., inside the factories. And we still have to find solutions which are, so to say, zero dust creating solution. That's for dust. I can give you an example of water. The examples are more just to illustrate the dilemma which we are facing. Today, a company which has to invest into a dry and arid area, for example, in a desert in Portugal or Spanish area or some other places in the world, then having a zero water, so to say, extraction facility is something which has to be designed right from the beginning, or zero water consuming mine is something which has to be designed right from the beginning. But when you have an existing mine which is on the river banks, when the taxonomy will indicate that yes, the water extraction rate has to go to zero, for example. I'm not saying that this is the case now, but when we are going in that direction, we have to be careful that the costs associated with such ambition are not extraordinary, not out of proportionality, essentially. And so the local context becomes important. So when we are determining, and that's a heavy debate right now within the platform, should we consider local context in terms of, for example, water use? So when we are discussing about pollution, then yes, of course, the pollution to water is an important aspect, and that should be decreased to nearly zero value. Be careful, both dust as well as water pollution measurement instrument are today the limiting factor of what can we achieve. So we have to design new measurement instrument. We have to design new technology. It was mentioned salination, for example. So you have to design new membrane materials which go beyond what is currently possible in terms of pollution prevention. So while the pollution both for dust, for water, for heavy metal discharge, whether it is diffused or through point discharge, have to be tackled, I think we have to first find out what are the best available technology. Are they deployed substantially throughout the industry? If not, how can we motivate that? While also at the same time developing new breakthrough technologies, new industries, and find industry partners who want to partner with academia, with financial institutions to take risks. I heard that to some extent we are expecting the banking community or the financial community is expecting steady revenue stream. But in case of industry, we are at the same time looking to see how can we take technical risk in order to fulfill the challenges which today's technology cannot fulfill. I mean, let us be frank, today, because this ambition was not given 5 years ago, today's industry is not in a position to fulfill all these ambitions. But of course, we understand we have to work with other sectors across the supply chain, with our partners, which means suppliers, but also customers, to design new products which allow, for example, availability of materials which do not pollute the streams for refining. I mean, these are some of the examples. Maybe I can go later on in details.
Well, I just follow up actually on those very interesting examples. So I guess the first question to test with you is, do the ambitious criteria still provide a useful benchmark, even when, say, only near to zero performance can be achieved on a particular subject? Or does that confuse everyone and basically make them feel like we can never achieve this now? We're not going to attract any finance because we can't go the whole way to zero today. So do the taxonomy criteria still play a role, even if the performance you believe is not there on the particular pollution issue?
No, so I think we are not yet there with the definitive discussion, definitive conclusion in the platform. This is what we are debating at this moment. When is ambitious also realistic? So the ambitious is realistic, but if, for example, based on the best available technology at pre-industrial scale, at least one plan can demonstrate that that ambition can be achieved. If even that cannot be demonstrated, I think we have to be careful that we are not scaring off investors as well as the industry to employ the sustainable finance taxonomy, because whether we like it or not, there is an unintended consequence associated with sustainable finance taxonomy, that what is not, and I think it will also come up in the questions, what is not considered taxonomy aligned is automatically unsustainable, even though that is not the intention. At least that is the interpretation today with the industrial partners, and we have to avoid it. So we have to make, of course, the criteria ambitious in line with the future requirement. But at the same time, we have to be realistic in seeing what is today achievable based on the best available technology. And the technology, by the way, is also based on science-based. So there is no contradiction in science-based objective, at the same time using the best available technology all over the world. So we are not restricting the technology development here. We are discussing on all over the world. I hope
very
that
good,
answers.
Mukund. Thank you. You've given a very good insight into the methodology we use for developing criteria, actually, in some ways, describing the technology availability. And I guess one consequence of that, if we are choosing the best available technologies, knowing that they're not quite yet consistent with the goal, is that we may need to amend or change those criteria in the near future or in the future, which of course introduces another challenge for business and finance. But nonetheless, that is the approach we take. Sometimes we give the best possible criteria for today, and we expect to amend them in future.
If I may give one more comment on that.
Of course.
So we have debated this heavily within, let's say, the non-ferrous metals commodity, which are, we have in Europe leaders, global leaders in terms of environmental performance, also social performance. But let us see, let us focus on pollution performers, whether it is metal emissions to water, whether it is metal emissions to air, etc. And when we get a lot of electronic waste today, which is already there in the society, whether it is in the, let's say, dumps or mines, etc., we need capacity to first isolate the value on one side, but also isolate the impurities and to fix the impurities so that they do not go back to the society in the sense that they will affect. And for all that, we need to develop technologies. So it is not only what we are doing for primary, it is also related very closely to circularity objective, this pollution objective. As was mentioned earlier, everything is combined with everything else. Thank you.
Thanks, Mukund. Sonia, maybe I can get you to comment on this question around the perception that everything that is not meeting the substantial contribution criteria is automatically unsustainable. Is that a discussion that you've had in your work in the platform, and do you have a reflection on it?
Well, I think personally, I think we are just at the moment developing the first batch of the criteria, and there will be more to follow. And actually, because we are looking at so many different industries, and even if you have one industry, you have so many different products and economic activities. It's a challenge to identify everything. And even if we focus on the things where a change is needed urgently, even then to catch that, it's for me it's quite also a new, it's a new perspective of how to look at that, and it's very complex, and I think that it will develop. It's a legislation and implementation which will develop over time, and so at the beginning we will see some of the sustainable activities, but that doesn't have not at all it doesn't say at all that all the others are unsustainable.
Thank you. No, I think that's right. Very good. Okay. So one of the other, so those were questions that were coming in through the discussion, and I've got a couple more that I'll just share with you now. And maybe Nick, you can respond to this one, or Sonia, support if needs be. So there's a couple of questions saying, how do we know that the criteria reflect the science? So how does the users of the taxonomy know? So maybe you can just reflect on what we try to do when we set criteria. So actually the questions are put around, say, the use of ecologists or biologists or specialist informed people. So Nick, would you be able to give a reflection on this?
Well, who better than me, given I'm a biologist by training, in fact, and I've worked as a biologist all my life. So essentially, yes, if we were to start from this aspect, the way the taxonomy criteria are being defined is by using as much as possible a palette of areas of know-how combined in a way that they can be cross-fertilize each other in a coherent and structured way to achieve targets which are both scientifically strong, ambitious, but at the same time achievable. So it is a very difficult balance to find. It's not at all easy. But just to put everybody's minds at ease, definitely there is a full mix of know-how and capacity in the people working on the taxonomy, and there's absolutely no doubt that all points of view are part of the discussion. So on that point, there's quite a lot of balance there. In terms of ensuring the credibility of the criteria, this is a very, very complex point. Because we are dealing currently, when we work on these 4 environmental objectives, which are not yet covered by a delegated act, we're facing objectives which have completely different nature, which are sometimes a very limited legal framework to which to refer to, or in some cases limited even scientific evidence or experience to support any decision. If we take circular economy, for example, there are many gray areas or completely black areas in the circular economy, in the actual application of circular economy. So it is not easy. It is not easy at all, and we find sometimes we are a little bit like breaking new ground in what we do almost every day. So we are really pushing the limit on defining things which have not been defined, or at least not thought of in the way the taxonomy needs to think about them. So what is sustainable, but at the same time allows people to have the right incentive to make the right investments, and doesn't preclude a lot of people in the market completely from being able to make investments which are considered green. So it's a very challenging exercise, but the scientific base is the starting point. So we and I think everybody in the group, I talk for the group I am working with, but I know that others are doing exactly the same thing. We start from what is the science, which is currently telling us in terms of evidence for specific main impacts, specific consequences, specific areas of uncertainty, and on that we try to build something which can be translated into a strong argument for what constitutes a substantial contribution. Which is a very, very elusive concept, but which it has to be defined at activity by activity and objective by objective level.
Thanks, Nick. That's very clear. So a couple more questions. I'm told by our support moderators that there's a lot of interest in 2 issues, one of which is around energy and what might happen on gas and nuclear. Now, I'm not asking you to make political forecasts here, but I think it might be interesting, at least for Mukun's example. Mukun talked about available technology and at proven costs. And of course, this is one of the criteria we've taken when thinking about what the criteria setting should be. And so that's been the case with energy. And Mukun, I will invite you, if you want, to reflect on gas and energy criteria using that type of thinking, but that's a matter for you. And then the other question is, there's a question, a specific term has been introduced, and I'd like to just unpack it, and that is safe and sustainable by design. which is a concept that I think we all understand what that means. It's applied in different ways. And the questioner is saying, well, there might be different interpretations of that and maybe not an agreed fine definition. So maybe the question then to take from that is, how do our criteria influence the thinking about sustainable design? How can the criteria change the way we think about designing our economic activities? So I can see Sonia nodding. So I think she might like to have a go at that one, which is great. And Mukund, how do you feel about the energy question? Would you like to have a go?
Yes, thank you, Nathan. I will. I know this is, let's say, sensitive and charged, so I will answer immediately for the gas, but I will also talk a little bit a parallel with pollution. The parallel with the pollution is when you are having a investment for membrane-based water treatment technology, the crucial element of that is a membrane, and that membrane is probably 10% or 20% part of the total infrastructure of the water treatment facility, but that is something which is consumable, which has to be changed. So after you invest into a membrane, 5 years later, you invest into a new membrane with much better capacity. So why it is related to the gas? When you are generating energy using gas, you can generate it using gas of high calorific value, low calorific value, but you can also use the similar equipment if it is technologically designed with nozzles which have to be replaced if you want to burn hydrogen in it, or if you want to burn, for example, biogas, which has a different calorific value, different particle contents, etc. So I think we have to be careful about stranded assets, which means when you are investing into technology, you have to invest in technology which is upgradable. But at the same time, we have to be realistic. If the amount of renewable gas which is required is not available, we have to find a transition solution. It's the same thing for gas, but it is also the same thing for the water treatment equipment. I hope that gives a basis for the answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you've captured the really interesting elements there and shown what the market must consider. So what is the risk of the stranded asset? What is the potential to upgrade? What is the environmental performance that can be achieved for the economic life of the asset? These are exactly the questions that we consider every day when we're setting criteria in the platform. So that's a very important, interesting answer. And I think also you were talking partly about gas in industrial settings. Is that right, when you were giving your answer?
Yes, that is correct. I'm concentrating on the gas for industrial use or the energy generated locally at the site itself.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, if you apply the same questions on stranded asset risk, upgrading potential for, say, precinct energy generation or a base facility on a wider network, then maybe some of the calculations are different when it comes to those types of facilities on whether or not the gas essentially can be abated or alternatives used. And so these are exactly the types of questions that have been addressed when we've set the criteria on energy generation. Thank you, Mukund. That's very interesting. So, Sonia, over to you on our design question.
Yes, safe and sustainable by design. I guess you will hear this expression a lot more in the coming years, I would say, but it's correct. There is no definition right now, and what we do, for example, in our team, we are defining from our perspective what does that mean. So, for example, for production of chemicals, we excluded some substance groups with certain hazardous property groups, intrinsic properties, sorry for that. And then we also do have the do no significant harm criteria. And this is actually, I love that, that is implemented in taxonomy. And it shows that for the other environmental topics, you can't go under a certain level. So you have to also look at all of those other 6 or, well, 5, 1 for the substantial contribution and 5 do no significant harm criteria. So in my eyes, this is already a little bit of a prediction of safe and sustainable by design. And Nathan, maybe I can also add a little bit to the question beforehand on who is involved in the platform, because actually I was quite pleased when I saw that a lot of NGOs are in the platform. I've worked on UN and EU level. And for example, in a committee of ECHA, and normally as an NGO, you are sitting there, you only have to listen. Sometimes you can do a comment, or you are thrown out if the discussions are getting intense. So this time, I'm quite pleased that the knowledge, and I guess that the NGOs can bring a lot of knowledge to the table, is really recognized. And well, we had also some difficulties now, but I'm also quite happy that it could be solved, and I'm really looking forward that in future all the criteria and the changes to the criteria have to be science-based, and also that we are able to comment on it.
Thank you, Sonia. It is true. We strive very hard in the platform to create a technical and evidence-based discussion. And we've tried in this panel to demonstrate the different types of experience and evidence that is welcome in our debate when we set our criteria. And Sonia makes the point. We need our environmental expert community for their understanding of the objectives, the environmental objectives, and to keep us clear on the scientific parameters that we must respect. And so this is essential. And for those of you who work in the environmental sciences area, there's no doubt that this is your time. We need you more than ever. And we try very hard in the platform to make sure this expertise is carefully considered and applied, even as we chart these industrial and economic questions as we set criteria. So a couple of questions which I think take this more broadly now. And Mukund, I'll come first to you and then to Nick. Mukund, as we think about supply chains and companies outside the EU, and the prospect that maybe there'll be many different taxonomies, what do you think are the priorities for us in Europe as we develop our taxonomies, and what are some of the considerations we need to take into account with our international business partners?
Yes, thank you for the question. Non-ferrous metals community in general is global because it's also globally traded in London Metal Exchange. So usually our associations are global in its nature. Whatever we are doing in Europe, we are also exchanging our thoughts with Americans, with Chinese, with Japanese, UK, etc. So the fact that taxonomy is a global phenomena has not gone unobserved within our community. So there is a lot of interest from our partners as to what we are doing, what is the methodology used, and more importantly, what is the ambition level we are thinking about. And that thought is already taken into consideration for new project investment. So as you know, a mine, when it wants to invest, it has to have a 10-year contract with a processor. So one downstream, a processor, when it invests, it has to contract with some of the automotive manufacturers, etc. So taxonomy is helping to, I would not say transform the society, but take into consideration the whole planning process at this moment. What the worry of many of the, let's say, partners involved on one side is what all has been ambitioned is going to be a reality. So there is some about the implementation. There are still some doubts about, okay, or is it a wave? Is it a bubble which will go over in 5 years, or is it something which is going to exist? That's one thing, but everyone is taking it seriously that it will come and we have to be prepared. So in that sense, it is providing a guidance.
Thank you, Mukund. And Nick, if we come back to you, what do you think have been the biggest changes inside the bank now that the taxonomy is coming into existence? What are the ways that you're seeing the taxonomy influence the thinking and the operations, and how it might change your practices in future? Give us a nice look forward as we start to draw this session to a close, if you can.
Thanks for the question, Nathan. Actually, if I had to summarize it in a few words, it's a revolution. I could not express in a different way. I mean, the bank is a very old institution, set in its ways. As you can imagine, it's like any institution of that size. It's got a very specific mandate, a lot of rules, very strict procedures, and every change takes a lot of time, effort, and convincing. First of all, I think that the process of change of mentality in the bank has started a few years ago. As you know, the bank has been the first issuer of climate bonds, so that is something that the bank has taken seriously and has taken pride in being the first institution in really believing in the change. And the success of the climate bonds and the fact that we've always reached our ambitious investment targets in the climate area in a very serious way, with a taxonomy which didn't exist in the form that it exists now, and was developed in agreement with other multilateral development banks in the context of international discussions. So we basically created everything from scratch in that sense, and we really walked the talk, so to speak. So we, in that sense, I think IAB can be really proud. Nevertheless, I think now the change which is happening now in the bank, with the taxonomy becoming so much at the forefront and expanding to a completely new and wider dimensions, in areas which are so encompassing of all of society and all of the economic sectors. This really needs a big and ambitious rethink of how the bank operates from within, meaning how the bank, as I said earlier, how the bank originates the projects. This is one of the most important elements. So the bank, which has been a bit of a receiving end, needs to become more proactive in defining what are and identifying it and supporting the promoters in defining what is a project and how this project can contribute to the environmental objectives. So this is definitely one important point. In addition, we have to be increasingly creative in the financial instruments that we envisage. There is I mean, this is not my sector, as I said, I'm a biologist, but the creativity that can be put in setting up financial instruments that make investment in areas which were previously not thought investable is definitely something that needs to be further explored. I mean, just to give you an example, EIB was closely collaborating with the Commission on the Natural Capital Financing Facility, which is precisely trying to explore the options of financing in biodiversity and ecosystems, which is not an easy task. So, I mean, these new areas have to be taken seriously. I mean, there are market barriers, which we have actually recently been exploring in a specific analysis that we've done of our investments in particularly in natural capital and in circular economy. We know what they are. Some we can try to tackle with EIB resources. Some require a more systematic change, which is not strictly dependent by EIB. But I think the taxonomy is going to create the momentum, and more importantly, is going to align the thinking of the promoters, the industry, the financial intermediaries in the same direction, so that people, first of all, talk the same language, and then we all see what are the targets, the priorities that we're looking at, because otherwise, there's a lot of confusion out there about what is a good environmental project, what is not, and that's probably that's actually certainly the main reason why the taxonomy was set up. So
we need to finish up in just a moment, Nick.
Yes. So in that sense, the EIB is again as it started 10 years ago with the climate bonds, is again at the forefront and is pushing the taxonomy and being the leader in this, in pushing the taxonomy forward as well.
Thanks, Nick, for those thoughts. The EIB definitely plays an essential role. If I gave you each 30 seconds for a last comment on what you hope for next, is there a final thought that you would share with our audience? Mukund?
We are striving in a very challenging internal discussion to achieve criteria which are ambitious but achievable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukund. Sonia?
Well, taxonomy is challenging, but is worthwhile and the only way forward.
Very good, succinctly put. And Nick, last word.
Well, I think that in essence, I would summarize everything saying we have to trust science. If we don't trust science and we don't trust what the facts are telling us, we are definitely not going to achieve the results we want, and this means that we are at risk.
Thanks, Nick. That's a great finish to our session. If I might just thank you on behalf of our audience, not only for appearing here today, but for the hours and hours of work that the days and days of work you're all putting in to develop this essential tool for our markets and for our economic future. Thank you for that. Well done. Strength to your arm. And thank you for joining us for this session today. Thank you to our audience. We hope you enjoyed the session, and we hope you enjoy all the events of this week.